Good morning and welcome to St Mary's University. I'm Simon Utley, and in addition to my job leading a busy Catholic secondary school in the south of England, I also have the privilege of being visiting professor in Catholic education here at St Mary's in the Institute of Education. Ex nihilo nihil fit, said Parmenides, and it's generally true that nothing comes from nothing. And it's certainly true of today's symposium, which partly derives its inception from the university's desire 10 years ago that we would mark Pope Benedict's visit with a real impact, a real legacy. A visit that, amongst other things, led to the foundation of the Benedict XVI Centre here at St Mary's, which is an international hub for research and engagement in religion and the social sciences. I'd also like to acknowledge the contribution of two people I've worked with, together with one of our speakers today, Chris Lamb, and that's Chris Locker and Andrew Lockington, who together with Professor Anthony Tarry and myself really derived the energy and the thoughts to try and bring this together today and to bring these three themes together, which I'll explain. So what was this buzz? What was this itch that needed to be scratched? Well, it was a sense that there was something in this area of communication, of witness, of mission and education that needed a voice. Not the jarring voices of the shouters, but the considered voices of those in dialogue, those whose hearts are indeed speaking to each other. And so this symposium is entitled Heart Speaks Unto Heart, which is pertinent on two counts. First, of course, it reminds us of St. John Henry Newman, who took this saying as his motto and, of course, was beatified 10 years ago by Pope Benedict on the same visit. But more pertinent, perhaps, is the idea that heart speaking and listening in love weaves a golden thread through the three presentations that we're going to hear today. This need to consider afresh how we can receive and reach out to each other in love, with integrity, in truth, and with special consideration for the young. And so we find ourselves today with a triptych, a set of three pieces intended to be appreciated together: media, mission, and education. And so to our first speakers. Speaking on media, we have Christopher Lamb, who is a multimedia journalist specializing in Vatican and religious affairs and is the Rome correspondent of The Tablet. Chris is a regular contributor to the BBC, and his book, The Outsider, Pope Francis and His Battle to Reform the Church, was published earlier this year. While in Rome, Chris has regularly traveled with Pope Francis, and he worked as a consultant and contributor to the groundbreaking two-part documentary Inside the Vatican, which was broadcast by BBC Two and PBS in the US. And during his 14 years journalistic career, Chris has worked for a range of international and national media outlets. Responding to Chris will be Rudy Noriega. Rudy has been a freelance broadcast journalist, a radio and podcast producer for nearly 20 years. In that time, he's worked for Radio Sweden International, BBC Radio 2, BBC Radio 5 Live, and his work has also featured on BBC Radio 4, Radio ARA in Luxembourg. Rudy was a producer for the production company Bite Your Legs for 6 years, and before COVID, he was the planning producer on 5 Live's Up All Night programme. At the moment, Rudy conducts interviews with authors on the station's overnight show, presented by Dotun Adebayo, and is also visiting lecturer on multimedia journalism at Bournemouth University. Rudy has contributed to 2 books on football and is the author of the entertaining Yellow Arrow Fever, The Grumpy Pilgrim's Guide to Santiago. We look forward to listening to them both.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Simon, and to St Mary's University for inviting me to speak at this symposium, looking back at Benedict XVI's visit and to examine the questions around the church and the media in relation to that visit, but also looking to the future. Looking back at Benedict's visit, I can recall very vividly and clearly the very hostile media coverage that was on display in the lead up to the trip. There was a real atmosphere that was developed in the mainstream media, at least, that the whole event, the whole trip could be some kind of disaster, would fall flat and potentially be disrupted by protesters. And I think we had two groups of people, I think, at that time. On the one hand, there were those who said, well, this visit of a pope is totally irrelevant. We're a secular country. We're not interested in what the Pope has to say. And then on the other hand, you had a group of potential protesters who were threatening to arrest the Pope and were threatening to disrupt the whole event. But what happened when Benedict XVI arrived in Britain was the fears that this would be a difficult visit melted away very quickly. Big crowds turned out. And of course, one of the highlights of the visit was the Pope's speech here at St. Mary's and his meetings here at St. Mary's University. And I think looking back on that trip, and certainly it's my understanding from inside the Vatican, that this trip was a huge success. One senior Vatican official has said to me that Benedict's visit was and is still considered one of the high points of his papacy. So why was that? I think there are two reasons, and I think they can offer us some lessons. The first was Benedict's humility and his warmth. He demonstrated that throughout the trip, and I think that is in itself a communications message. Is not what you say; it's the actions that come first when communicating. And it was also the speeches, the content of what Benedict had to say, that made real impact and still have resonance. Benedict sought to engage the culture, and I think particularly of the two speeches that he made, the first is the one at Westminster Hall to the legislators, to the politicians and civic leaders of the UK, where he pointed out in a speech looking at the relationship between religion and civic society and secular society. He said that religion is not a problem for legislators to solve, but a vital contributor to the national conversation. And I think in that line, he distilled what the approach should be for the church when engaging the public square and the media. It's beautifully summed up by Benedict's line there. And I also think that the second important speech was the one he gave at St. Mary's to young people. And again, it was a critique of the culture, but also delivering a very clear and succinct message. He said to young people, I'm asking you not to pursue one limited goal in your lives and ignore the others. He said, having money, having fame, having success, yes, they're all good things of themselves, but they will not make you happy. Happiness is something that is found somewhere else. The true happiness is found in God. And I think we saw in that message that he distilled in St. Mary's University, I think a very compelling message that the church can take on today. And I think when you look at the challenges that the church is facing, the Catholic community, all Christian communities are facing in relation to the media and relation to engaging the culture, it's not attacks or criticism, but it's apathy and indifference. And what Benedict showed was that when the church engages with the culture, when it has a message that speaks to people heart to heart, as this symposium is trying to look at within that theme, when it speaks in that way, it has traction, it has impact, and it can make a difference. But 10 years on from Benedict's visit, and a lot has changed. The media landscape has changed utterly. Benedict's trip to Britain took place, or ended, 2 weeks before the launch of Instagram, the fastest growing social media platform, which is not just a platform where people want to share their holiday snaps. It is now a key platform for news organizations and news platforms. His visit took place before Twitter had become the political platform that it is today. It was a year before the release of Snapchat, and Benedict's trip took place 8 years before TikTok. So Benedict's trip came just before and during what we can describe as a fourth industrial revolution, which is the digital revolution that is ongoing and is something that has had huge impact since that trip of Benedict to Britain. So I think the question for the church and the Catholic community is how to utilize the new platforms, how to respond to the digital revolution that is taking place. And I'd like to make three talking points. I have not got all the answers at all, but I'd like to use what I hope what I say can be a platform for continuing the discussion after Rudy has spoken, and we can have some discussion in the chat box and more broadly. And I also want to use the experience that I've had in reporting on Pope Francis's ministry and the Vatican. And I think we can say that Pope Francis is a brilliant Christian communicator and a brilliant communicator of the gospel and applying the words of the gospel to people's lives. And so I'm going to use some of the experience that I've had in covering the Pope's ministry to see what else can be learned from that. So I think the first point I want to make is that the great challenge for the church is how to witness to the gospel across the new social media platforms, how to engage new digital audiences. I think an approach to the media which is simply issuing press releases, issuing statements, hunkering down, hoping bad news will go away, is no longer workable. There has to be a move from a reactive approach to a proactive approach. You have to tell the story. And of course, the church is operating within this digital media space in a hyper-competitive marketplace of ideas and spiritualities. There is no guaranteed audience. You have to build that audience. And the danger is that if you don't engage in this marketplace, that really it's a drift into irrelevance. You don't get your voice heard. So there has to be a real understanding that not engaging is not an option, and that these audiences are there to be won, but it is about recognizing the hyper-competitive nature that the church is operating. And also that social media, for those outside of the church, for the younger generation, social media channels and platforms will be the first point of encounter for many people. And so it's vital that the church and Catholic communities think about how to develop content that makes people think, that starts a conversation, and that recognizes that this social media encounter is the first encounter. It shouldn't be about proselytizing, otherwise you'll be muted or even blocked. The second point is on Pope Francis's approach to the media. Now, I think there are lessons that can be learnt here. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I think it points the way. And the first is the Pope's attitude to the media. One thing that strikes me about Francis is how at ease he is with journalists. And I've had my own personal experience of that, covering Pope Francis on the papal plane and on the trips abroad. As journalists, if you get to go on a papal visit, you get put at the back of the plane. You pay a business class fare for an economy class seat. And you, when the plane takes off, the Pope comes to greet each journalist individually. And you know, from witnessing the Pope in those encounters, I can see that he's someone who really is very at ease. He's not afraid of journalists. He's not afraid of making jokes. I mean, I joked with him once about a difficult situation he was dealing with in the Vatican. He replied to me, "Se cattivo," meaning you're naughty, which was very perceptive. But I mean, it's that willingness to engage, to not be afraid, and I think that's what Pope Francis has shown. And he wants to engage not just with journalists, but influencers and opinion makers. He wants to communicate without a filter, and that you can see that through the number of books that he's been collaborating with people over the way that he picks up the phone to people, the way that he's not looking to somehow spin the message. The age of spin really is dead in that respect. And I think we can see that when you communicate without the filter, when you take a risk, it can pay great dividends. And I've seen that in my own reporting as well. I mean, I've tried, when covering the Vatican and covering Rome, to look at a multimedia platform approach. So when I was at the back of the papal plane, I went live to Facebook and talked about what it was like on the plane. And it was amazing the engagement that I got from people who I wouldn't expect at all to be interested in what the Pope was doing. So there was a great opportunity there, and I think that Pope Francis is showing that through social media. The other approach that the Pope has taken to the media is a defense of journalism and free speech. Now, this is actually a development in the Vatican. Popes in the past have not been defenders of the rights of free speech, but this Pope has, and I think that's very important in relation to the digital world that we are living in, given the pandemic of misinformation that we've seen. It is one of the real threats to our democracy and to our society, the misinformation and fake news. I should say misinformation more than fake news, because fake news is a very specific category, but this pandemic of biased or misleading information is a real problem. And I'm afraid it is also a problem within the Catholic media. And if you read my book, The Outsider, you'll get chapter and verse on how misinformation has been used in an information war against the Pope himself. But the Pope's defense of journalism is very important in relation to this, because I believe the Church should take a very strong stand against this, and should be looking to find ways to proactively respond to information that is not correct. And the Pope has taken that stance, and I think it's one that the rest of the Church should follow. And it's very much in keeping with what Benedict XVI has talked about in the past, particularly that very striking phrase he used just before his election as Pope, of the danger of a dictatorship of relativism. Now, what did that really mean? What that meant was that the truth is under assault, and that this dictatorship of relativism says there is no truth. Now, of course, when we look at social media, when we look at the battle that goes on so often on those social platforms, it is almost like the truth doesn't exist. And I think the Church should be taking a very strong stance and saying that there is a truth here, and we are fighting misinformation because we believe in that. So it's not just the defense of journalism that's important for Francis, it's also his reforms of the Vatican media itself. Now, this is not often talked about, but I think it's a very important reform. Francis has set about building a multi-platform content service for the Vatican. Of course, Benedict sent the first papal tweet, but Francis has built on that engagement with social media through embracing different platforms. Of course, I'm not saying that Pope Francis sits there with a smartphone posting to social media, but he has certainly utilized the platforms around him through his collaborators. And what the Vatican has done has been to obviously embrace different forms of social media, and has developed a massive following for the Pope on the various platforms. But they've also made sure that the Vatican News is a trusted source of information, and that the Vatican news outlets, L'Osservatore Romano, for example, is a place where if you want to understand the mind of the Pope, you can read that and you can get good information. Now, that is also a change, because whilst in the Catholic media, in some parts of the Catholic media, there has been this information warfare going on, unfortunately misinformation, biased information. In many respects, the Vatican's official news arms have become trusted. Now, in the past, the Vatican's news content was, or the L'Osservatore Romano, for example, the newspaper, was seen as basically Pravda or propaganda sheet. and could not be trusted. But actually, what we're seeing with this change in the digital transformation and in the world of social media, with misinformation, etc., that actually the Vatican's channels are trusted to give reliable information. Okay, you're not going to get all the inside details, but you are going to get information that can be used and can be trusted. And so there is in a sense, a lesson there that the church can build its own platforms and its own content, which can tell its story and take its message out to the world. And that comes to, that brings me to my third point and final point, which is that the evidence is there that there is an audience that wants to hear the story of the gospel, wants to listen to what the church has to say, and is open to what the church's story is all about. And I think that is really important to remember, particularly in light of what we've seen with the COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdown. We saw that 1 in 4 people in the UK accessed religious service online. The Church of England had 400,000 people watch their online service on Palm Sunday. And there is also evidence that parish churches that have an active social media presence have witnessed a growth in numbers. So there is an audience there, but the challenge is about telling the story. It's about doing that across the platforms, engaging the TikTokers, engaging Generation Z. It does require a fresh thinking and a new approach. I don't think it's just about age. I mean, the US Senator Ed Markey, who's 74, who recently won re-election, he had a huge support for TikTokers. Pope Francis at 83, his huge media popularity shows it's not just an age thing, but it is about being willing to take a new approach and adopt some fresh thinking. I also think the important message of the church when it comes to social media should be a refusal to become involved in ideological disputes and polarization that we see across the media. Misinformation is one challenge. The other one is polarization. Pope Francis' encyclical, which is due to come out on the 4th of October, I understand is going to look at a lot of these questions. How do we avoid the fragmentation and divisions that unfortunately social media and digital media is fueling? How do we overcome that? So that encyclical that the Pope has finished and is going to publish is definitely worth following on this point. But I do think when it comes to social media and the digital revolution that's been taking place, the church needs to adopt a new mentality, almost the mentality of a startup, to be nimble, less institutionally obsessed, much more outward looking. Francis himself is a good example. He's someone who, he doesn't really have a big office. He literally works in the rooms in Santa Marta in the guest house. He wants to be free to shift his attention wherever he needs to. The Amazon church is a good example of a church adopting that startup mentality. The new Amazon leadership body, the Amazon Ecclesial Conference that was established recently, which is a broad coalition of bishops and lay people and indigenous representatives, which is a kind of a first, this new Amazon Ecclesial Conference. It doesn't have an office. They're operating in a far less institutionally focused way. And of course, with working from home, with all the pressures that have been brought on by the pandemic to change the world of work and the way of working, I think that's where things are moving to. So in conclusion, I think finding the content platforms that speak to new audiences, that speak to the growing number of spiritual seekers and a new generation needs to be a top priority for the church, the Catholic community, and all Christians. I think we need an attitude of listening and the courage to try new things. It's something that can involve everyone, anyone who has a smartphone. It doesn't have to just be professional journalists and writers. We've even seen with the decline of the local newspapers and the terrible impact that has on communities. We've seen, at least in one example of a church in Kent, a church actually employing a journalist to go out there and tell stories. Very interesting initiative. something that could be looked at and considered. The digital channels that are on offer give a great opportunity for all of us in the church to become proactive storytellers, witnessing to the gospel and trying to connect people with the life of the church. So thank you for listening, and I'm going to hand over now to Rudy to respond, and look forward to keeping the discussion going later on.
First of all, I'd like to thank Chris for sharing his thoughts. As he's pointed out, in the media world, things have changed a huge amount in the last 10 years. Indeed, in this century, it's changed beyond all recognition. And as Chris says, the church has to respond. We can't risk the chance of being irrelevant. It has to be more active than passive now. It's not enough for people to go onto the internet, look at the church website, look at the online newsletter. It's time to look at getting the message across. It's time to put the message out there. The social and digital world, as I'm sure you're aware, is not always a pleasant one. I've worked for a long time on various BBC News programmes, and the hate and the vitriol that comes in as a story, an ongoing story, is unfolding, particularly when it's tragic, can test your faith in your fellow human beings. There's a lot of nastiness out there. We're all aware of that. I've worked with presenters who've been verbally abused and been threatened. People are quick to judge, and issues can become polarised very, very easily. Discussions where there's common ground soon become black and white because there's no room for nuance. It's a good and a bad thing, but we have to operate within that. So why should the church get involved at all, either at a macro or indeed micro level? Well, the answer, as Chris said, is to stop the spread of indifference and misinformation. It's to become part of the conversation, and strangely, given the means of communication that we're talking about, it's to provide a human face to what's going on. A lot of the time, certainly in the British media, institutions are portrayed as being these great monoliths, faceless, autocratic, as if they're controlled by computers rather than people. We can't let the church be seen like this. The church is nothing without its people. And there's an opportunity to reach out there and reach out to communities in ways that have not been possible before. There's a cartoon that regularly features in my mother's parish newsletter, which features the caption, "Preach the gospel, use words if necessary." This is a quote that's attributed to St. Francis of Assisi. I've spent the last week trying to back this up, and the best I can say about that is I wouldn't put that in the news programme as being authentic. But we'll stick with it for the moment. An evangelical Christian website I looked at earlier this week disputes that kind of argument. I'm not going to get into that particular argument now. But if you think about it, think about actions and deeds. Even the most hardened atheist will accept that churches do a great deal of charitable work, whether that's fundraising for various projects, contributing and running food banks, or just providing a shoulder to cry on. Maybe it's time to spread this message and get it out there a little bit more and bring more people in. The church isn't a faceless structure. It's full of lots of people doing a little bit to make the world a better place to help others. The worst that can happen by adopting social media is to remove fear, alienation, and dislike that people may already have, while the positive side may mean new members, growth. If this means sending TikTok videos or pictures on Instagram, let's bring it on, let's go for it. In the competitive media world, as Chris mentioned, it would be madness not to try. There will be failures, of course there will. And there will be successes too. It's a bit like the Wild West out there. We don't know what works and what doesn't. Good news does not fill up a lot of time on mainstream media. It's great on social media. People appreciate it. There's a whole world out there we can go for. TikTok and Instagram, for the moment at least, are friendly and positive places to go. Let's put the message out there. I've worked in radio news programs, as Simon mentioned right at the beginning, for nearly 20 years. And while digital and social media reinvents itself all the time, traditional conventions on what people refer to as mainstream media die hard, if indeed they die at all. The procedure in most shows, when dealing with an issue, and I'm sure you're really familiar with this, is you recruit a person from one side of an argument and then put somebody with the other side of the argument on at the same time and get them to discuss and then argue and then row their way through wherever the allotted time is. Quite often, this is 5 minutes or even less. If you're watching or listening at home, whether the subject is fox hunting, the current state of United States politics, the pros and cons of genetically modified food, I would be amazed if anyone has had their opinion changed by a traditional radio TV debate. If you have, by the way, please let me know in the question and answers. I would really genuinely like to know, but I think it just supports whatever prejudices you already have. If people had an opinion beforehand, they will only have that opinion reinforced. And if they didn't have an opinion, they won't have learned an awful lot in that 5 minutes to gain one. This is not the best way to spread the message of the gospel. Essentially, you're preaching to the converted, while hoping to limit the damage of the people who didn't really like you in the first place. By all means, the church should get involved in these debates, but it should also remember the limitations and what the motives behind them are as well. In situations like this, I hate listening to radio and television debates. I'm reminded why broadcasting is called a medium. It's because it's neither rare nor well done. Most media outlets are trying to get younger people to read their magazines and newspapers, listen to their broadcasts, watch their television programs. I've spent hours in the meetings listening to various plans and ideas to make the 18 to 35 demographic, or whichever one it is, to listen to more radio. At the end of these meetings and discussions, there are no clear answers. I'm sorry, I'll break it to you now, there won't be any clear answers after today either. But there are some doubts, indeed, if the audience actually exists. I teach university students, and every time I get a new class, I ask them how many of them have actually bought a radio. The last time anyone said yes was 2017, and I've had 2 positive answers since 2015. These days, people get their news elsewhere, and the times when people listen to the radio or had background music on, listening to networking programs, is disappearing. It's the sound of the podcast or the YouTuber that's likely to be on while my students are writing essays. And that's where the church has to be too. That's where it can get its message across, either directly or simply by setting itself up to serve a community in as many practical ways as possible, as well as spiritual means. The church should be making sure that people have a place to go to if you're in need, even if they don't follow the faith. A great example of this, I was talking to a friend of mine about it earlier this week. Credit unions, a great practical idea. The UK has a multi-faith one called the Church's Mutual Credit Union. I have friends who work at this at local level, and they tell me about the big differences that can be made to the lives of many in their communities. And I'm not sure this kind of thing is publicised enough. This is real practical help. It should be advertised, it should be sold. The need is there. People are unashamed now to call themselves spiritual. You find this everywhere. They talk about the beliefs at great length. It's not something to be embarrassed about, unless, of course, it seems if you mention religion. One of the other great changes of the 21st century is the rise of spiritual websites, self-help books. People are looking for guidance, but they're looking for solutions in places where the church doesn't operate successfully, at least at the moment. There's no shortage of people fighting for social justice, younger people particularly. The church has been doing this for years, and it makes sense to take advantage of this overlap. The audience is there and we can find it. Although the media may have changed, the message really hasn't. What will always be needed is for people to communicate, and we need them more than ever. More good voices have to be heard, and they need to be heard on various platforms, not necessarily Catholic or indeed religious. We're back to the idea of spreading the gospel and only using words if necessary. The good work that CAFOD does should be known much more about. Making sure that people know that the C in CAFOD stands for Catholic might not be a bad start. What churches do at local level, apart from celebrate Mass every Sunday, should also be advertised. If this can be done with photos and videos to make it more human, then it should be done. What harm can it do? And as I mentioned earlier, while traditional forms of media news tend to focus on the negative, The world of digital and social media can be a much more positive experience as long as you stay away from Twitter, it would seem. It's worth bearing in mind everything that Chris has said, and I echo. Wherever you go on social media, there will be haters. Haters will hate, and they're always going to be there. We have to live with that. This is not a time for talking, as Christopher said, about division and apportioning blame, nor is social media necessarily the place to do this. Sharing positive news, offering help, increasing the human profile of the church. These are all things that can be done at local level. The church has to reach out though. It has to break through the suspicion and prejudices that people have. Given recent events in the church, there's a lot of ground to crawl back here, and we all have to work on that. Let's do that by making sure the role in the community is recognised and celebrated and publicised by all means at our disposal. This could be podcast, this could be video, it could be Snapchat. There's nothing wrong with a visual parable. Like Chris, I can't provide any cast iron solutions, and predicting the future is a dangerous business. If I had the gift of foresight, I wouldn't have shelled out an awful lot of money for a diary this year. But the rise of online worship during this time of COVID-19 gives great reasons for optimism. The ingenuity that some parishes have displayed in creating services, getting together, and helping the poor and vulnerable is something that can be built on. Chris's story of a journalist working at a local level is something that should be encouraged. Local newspapers are closing. Local radio is underfunded. Commercial radio is becoming more and more centralised. There is a role that can be filled there. On a national and international level, great communicators are needed, where words are necessary to preach the gospel. Pope Francis, as Chris has mentioned again, uses Twitter to great effect. He talks about God's love, reflects on the Gospels. Even so, he has fewer features on the app than the Dalai Lama. All of us have to up our game on this, even the Pope. There are challenges out there, and the church needs to respond in print, on the air, and on every media outlet. It's also necessary to accentuate the huge positives that it possesses. The charity work is superb. The people who are part of the church, let's recognise that. Let's get them involved. It's not difficult. It's not expensive. And if the church wants to attract new people, it needs to go out and find them. As the disciples were forced to discover, this involves casting your net in the appropriate place. I'd like to thank Chris once again and all the people here at St. Mary's for organising this symposium, and it's time now to hand back to Simon. Thank you very much.
So very briefly for me, first of all, very big thanks to Chris and to Rudy. We're going to take a couple of minutes now just to give you a chance to ask some questions, and then Chris and Rudy will be pleased to respond to that. So we'll just take a couple of minutes to give you some time to think about that.
Okay, thank you, David Harris, who's asked, in your experience, have you seen a social media channel that is getting communication for the church right? Well, I would point to James Martin, Jesuit priest in the US, who has 250,000 followers on Twitter, a big following across all platforms. I think he's getting it right because he's going for the content of the gospel and he's responding to the culture. He's not shying away from the difficult debates around politics, etc. But he always roots his content in the gospel, and his following is very big, and he's definitely making impact. I don't know if Rudy wants to, someone in a social media channel that's successful in the church.
It's not something I know huge amounts about, but there is a Franciscan whose name I wish I could remember, who's on YouTube.
Oh yes, I know. That's Father Casey. Yeah, Father Casey. I can't remember his second name. If you Google Father Casey OFM, he's brilliant. He again is very good on video, very good at rooting his message in the gospel, and is definitely making a big impact. I'll try and find his surname later on. What are the most pressing training needs for those in leadership to ensure that social media is used effectively? Well, I think with social media, you've got to just get on and try and do it. I think you learn through trial and error. I think you learn through experience. I think there are courses that can be gone on, and I think the most effective training, I think, is around the technical stuff. I think it's understanding the analytics, understanding which platforms reach which audiences, understanding how to read the data of social media. Because I mean, there's no point spending your life posting into a void, or getting out there on Twitter and no one following you, or getting out there on Facebook or Snapchat and no one following what you're doing. I think it's important to follow the data and the analytics. So to know that Sunday evening is a good time to go live to Facebook, for example, to know that you have got a big audience of a lot of interest in this part of the world, or which topics and which things are actually getting traction. So yeah, I think the best training is around the data and the analytics to understand which platforms are the most effective. Father Casey Cole, that is the Franciscan I mentioned. Check him out. He's definitely making an impact. He's quite young, relatively young, and very big on video, very big on on directly responding to the kind of the big questions that are going on in the world. And to pick up on what Rudy said, Father Casey's very strong on the social justice questions, and applying that to the Franciscan spirit as well.
No, there's the other question that came in earlier about LBC. If I just move that forward. Right. So this is from Joe. A question about LBC. For all those who don't know, LBC is a talk radio station based in the UK, which operates under slightly different broadcast rules to most of the others. It does have a huge audience, and it has some incredibly good presenters. I know people who work on there as well. And again, they are listened to worldwide. The effectiveness, it depends. For me, I've never had a state where I've learned something new from a particular phone. And it's great if somebody's giving a personal testimony. That's when they really, really work. But in terms of an argument, I think generally it's very difficult to have your mind changed by what you hear in a traditional radio TV argument. I may be wrong, but for me, they don't particularly work. Thankfully, I've worked on programs where we don't do them. But if it works for you, that's fine. I can't really argue with that.
On that point about LBC, isn't one of the reasons why they've been successful is that they allow everyone to have a voice. They give a show to people from across the spectrum. So they've kind of avoided some of the polarization, or the ideological polarization that some media have gone. So they don't go in for cancel culture or no platforming.
One of the advantages they have, there are strict laws in terms of what you can say in terms of bias. One of the ways LBC is slightly different is they will have presenters who have a certain political bias. It's balanced out over the course of a week, I believe. And the idea being that they can say things, they can provoke arguments, they can provoke discussions. That makes it a very different place to listen to, and indeed a really entertaining and a useful place to listen to. This is where all the great political discussions take place when there's a general election, because that format is so much better suited to that kind of argument.
Okay. And Joe Sedliecka points out that LBC stopped having Nigel Farage, so there are some limits, obviously. But I'd like to ask you, as a producer of radio, what your view is on this whole question of giving both sides, because we do see in the media this both sidism that's going on. So someone stands up, and I'm thinking particularly in US politics with Trump, someone will stand up and say something that's clearly false, clearly misleading, but the debate is moved in that direction, and then the mainstream media, all the producers feel they've got to give someone defending the outrageous comment and someone attacking it, and that doesn't really get to the bottom of things, does it? I mean, this both sidism, which was particularly seen in the BBC, how do you respond to that?
I'm so pleased you asked me that. It depends on the subject. The one that provokes the big argument, the one that provokes the most discussion, certainly that provokes the most emails, most phone calls, is actually global warming.
Right.
And technically, you don't have to put any opposition up to that, and that's the thing that causes the issue. People insist that the science isn't correct, it's misleading, it's overjudged. But that is the thing that provokes the most discussion. Also, it's the same thing on BBC websites. If you want to look at how many comments are sent for a global warming story, and that is something where there's no direct need to put any kind of opposition up to at all. There are certain issues that have happened in certain programs on various networks I won't mention specifically, where a producer has been asked to create a discussion where there was no real discussion to be had. And so I can certainly think of one. I can't go into specifics, unfortunately. And quite often there is just no debate to be had.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a very, very important point, a very important issue, because what I was saying about defending journalism is that good investigative journalism, which gets to the bottom of a story, is absolutely priceless and very, very, very important. We've got another question. Could you give us a few words on the upcoming encyclical? Well, I mentioned in my talk that the Pope's encyclical will be looking at the whole question of division, fragmentation, polarization. It's going to be a very broad canvas, and it's focused on this idea of fraternity, and very much in the mold of St. Francis of Assisi. So I think there's a great opportunity for the Church to communicate a kind of countercultural message in some respects to what we see with polarization in social media and digital. I also understand that the encyclical will look at digital questions and the digital culture. So I think it's definitely worth looking at that, focusing on that. And yeah, I think that one of the things that the Pope is trying to do with his encyclicals is make sure that they do try and have a wider impact, not just within the Church. Laudato Si was extremely effective at impacting the political debate around, you mentioned climate change and the environment. Although, of course, within parts of the Church, Laudato Si is a sort of totally unknown thing because of the political persuasions of some people in the US Catholic Church. So Laudato Si has much more impact amongst atheists and non-believers than sometimes Catholics. But that's a slightly different debate. But one of the problems the encyclical has had, and I'd be interested in your views on this really, is that the title of the encyclical, which is Fratelli Tutti, which means literally brothers all, but can also be translated brothers and sisters all. But it's been seen as quite divisive, not inclusive enough in terms of language. How sensitive does the Church need to be to this question of language, inclusive language, and that whole debate, which can definitely flare up a lot on social media?
Well, the issue generally with social media is trying to convey nuance in a short amount of words. Unfortunately, this is something that we have to focus on quite a bit. It is very easy. People are going to hate. People are looking to be angry. And wording has never really been more important than it is now. In longer form, if you're doing something in a podcast, if you're doing something in a video, it's a lot easier. It's in my opinion, the way to go forward. If you're trying to convey something that's complicated, don't do it on Twitter.
You mentioned podcasts. How difficult is it to set up a podcast and to start doing a podcast? And would you advise people just to start doing one, or how much preparation should they do? Because it is quite a competitive marketplace, the podcast one.
Yes, I mean, podcasts are more and more of them. Again, this is a situation I mentioned about being in the Wild West. It's incredibly straightforward to do. Microphones are cheaper, editing, should you wish to do editing. There are online things that you can use that are actually free. Uploading, you can go via various websites. You can choose which particular plans. Some are free. It's straightforward. Like all things, the hard bit is actually marketing it. It's just letting you know that people are there. And that's where you have to talk to people, talk to you. If you're doing anything particular with your parish, make sure it's advertised there. If you're doing anything that goes beyond that, make sure that people know about it. But actually setting up a podcast is fine. Getting people to know it's there is a lot more difficult, but it's reasonably straightforward. There are microphones are cheaper. As I say, it's not difficult.
Now, we both mentioned TikTok, and we need to probably be a bit more honest with people, because TikTok, although I do have an account, it's mainly used by my 11-year-old son. And there is a generational issue here with TikTok, but TikTok is a massive platform. It seems to me a mixture of some, there's obviously some brilliantly creative stuff. There's stuff that is frankly, you wouldn't want to engage with it too much. What about something like TikTok? I mean, this is kind of jokey, creative, fun internet culture. How would the church going about engaging with it? I know there's at least one Anglican bishop I know on TikTok. I don't think there's any Catholic bishops on TikTok, but how should the church go about engaging with this platform?
Hard if it's the generation. I'm the same as you, right? And the idea of me making a TikTok video, as you may have gathered, there is a reason I work in radio. I'm not looking at myself on the screen is absolutely terrifying. If there's a generational issue, let the generations who use it. Let them to promote it. Get them to promote it. If it's a confirmation thing, if it's a communion thing, if it's the generation that are happy to use it, why not let them make the videos? Let them do the presentation. If they can explain it to priest, bishop, cardinal, so much the better.
So why couldn't an RE class produce a TikTok? Why can't the First Communion class produce a TikTok? Look at it like that, because I think that's the big change that's happening. So it should be encouraged for people to start engaging with that medium, although it's still, I think, still very new, but that's probably a reason why the church should do more.
The other thing with new media generally is they tend to be quite friendly at the beginning. It all goes a bit hostile later on. It's best to get in now.
Yes, I think that's right. Now, if there are more questions, please do put them in the chat box. So someone's saying, is money key to making an impact through social media, or is that secondary to engaging with imagination? Well, I think one of the issues, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, Rudy, but one of the issues around making impact, particularly when it comes to Facebook and other platforms, is that you can get a certain number of followers, you can get a certain level of audience, but then you are really encouraged to pay for adverts, to pay for posts to be promoted. And so this is the algorithm that the social media companies are using. If you want to make big impact, then there does have to be some investment in the posts. I mean, obviously you can get a lot of organic growth over time through working hard at it, but I think there is certainly a financial element.
It also helps who you know. Certainly, if you're promoting something, if you can get a retweet, if you can get a mention somewhere else by somebody you know who has a lot more followers than you, that helps as well. It's more content, I would think, than money. If you've got something good out there, people will find it. I mean, you have to let them know it's there. And if you can get somebody else to promote it as well, that will help a great deal.
Yes. So I think there is obviously that financial element to it, but as you say, if you can get people to promote your content, that's very effective. Joe Sidlietska points out that TikTok is good for bite-sized stuff. Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's only about 90 seconds or even less. People also asked earlier about other good examples of best practice, and I think there are lots of good examples out there. I mean, the Bishops' Conference have a good podcasts. Joe's website, ICN News, gives a lot of information. I know the Jesuits in Britain do a lot of very interesting things. Father Damien Howard, he may talk about that later. But there are a lot of other good examples out there, and I think it's worth looking at them and seeing what they're doing. So I've been asked here about one form of social media. If I had to pick one form of social media, what would it be? Well, the social media platform where I probably have the most followers is on Twitter. Now, Twitter is a place where there's a lot of criticism. It's highly politically charged, and it can be a difficult place to offer nuance and offer kind of a broader take on things. But it is very effective, and it is a way of making impact, particularly on a breaking news story.
It's a strange thing, Twitter. I mean, I've described it in the past as a sort of the 21st century version of the lynching mob. It's very difficult to have nuanced conversations, and I often think a lot of the rows that I read about on Twitter, there's a lot of common ground there. If you sat down over a tea and a bun, there'll be common ground, and it needn't be so bitter. I've just signed up to Instagram, which I'm a big fan of at the moment, and I quite like that. Obviously, if you're going beyond social media and digital media, I would say podcasts are great, but then again, I work in radio and I would. But there's a great way of getting your message across. There's a lot of fun you can have with sound as well.
Yeah, I think Twitter, and particularly what we call Catholic Twitter, which has got its own hashtag, Catholic News, Catholic Twitter, has, in some respects, has polarized people, and it can be very much us versus them. And I think the real challenge is to overcome that divide at times, which we see so much on Twitter. And of course, the thing about Twitter is it's always trying to encourage you to react to the latest thing. Of course, that's its business model in some respects. So there, of course, are downsides there, but it's also a brilliant way of connecting with people all over the world, and from seeing how opinion develops, seeing what's happening. So although I have to say Twitter is not a growing platform, it's actually a shrinking social media platform. Obviously Facebook is the biggest, but Instagram is the fastest growing, and then you've got the other smaller ones that are coming through. But Twitter is not a growing platform, so that is one thing to consider, I think, particularly when we have these vicious Catholic struggles on Twitter, to remember actually the Twitter platform, although it's very important, is not the fastest growing platform, is not growing at all. A question here about the end of universal Catholicism as we know it. Well, I think it could go both ways. I think on the one hand, I think social media can connect people with Catholics across the world. I know I've been connected up to people all in a whole range of places all over the world, through social media, through the world digital. So I think on the one hand, it can certainly connect people up. I think the danger, though, and I think this is the implication of the question, is that it can lead to splits and polarization, and it is certainly a threat to the global communion, because the social media platforms do or can become very divisive.
Yeah, we're going back to Twitter versus the rest here, really, aren't we? Certainly, if you follow some of the debates that are happening in the Catholic Church on Twitter, it's nasty. Again, it's a fault of the format in the sense that anything that's nuanced can't be discussed sensibly. And people go from 0 to very, very angry very, very quickly. There are other forms that are friendlier, and there is certainly a danger of polarization. But again, we're going back to something I mentioned when I was speaking earlier. Social media is not necessarily the place for this kind of debate. I think, as I mentioned before, that if you just sat down and talked to somebody, there's a lot more common ground than you'll be led to believe, certainly on Twitter. But there's other social media where it's a bit more friendly, a bit more sociable. If you want to get across something complicated, don't do it there.
There's a question about Catholic media, legacy media, outside of the institutions of the Church, responding to the new media landscape. Well, I suppose I can talk a bit about what the tablet has been trying to do, and particularly during lockdown, this has certainly focused a lot of thinking around engaging with digital. And one of the things the tablet has done quite successfully is offer a number of Zoom webinars, and that's something that is going to be taken forward a lot, which is it's a great way of having a more nuanced and deeper conversation. And I've been involved with at least 2 of these webinars. In one case, we spoke to Cardinal Michael Czerny in Rome about his work with migrants. And I think this webinar format is definitely a way of engaging new audiences and offering, alongside with obviously the print media platform, this is a way of engaging people with the content. And I think certainly Zoom webinars, podcasts, and in my own work, I've tried to innovate. I've tried to use Facebook Lives, I mentioned on the Papal Plane. I've tried to use video, trying to also use more audio reporting as well to try and engage people and to try and adapt to the new media landscape. I think that America magazine have been pretty successful. From what I understand, I believe they do have the biggest impact in terms of US Catholic media, in terms of number of hits to their site, number of people reading their articles, and they have followed very much a multi-platform model. I know that Matt Malone, the editor there, has really focused on this. They've also gone to do more Zoom webinar work and also podcasts. As for Jim Martin, I think most of his reporting and most of his work is done through social media. He writes books, he does write for the magazine, but really America magazine, I think, is a very good example of a Catholic legacy media that has transformed itself, and it's certainly something that is happening at the moment at the tablet.
I'm not sure I know enough about this to really discuss it. I do follow James Martin on Twitter, and the thing is, whether you agree with him or not, if there's something there to think about, it's something there to discuss. It's not something to go out and be aggressive and hate. This goes for anyone who expresses an opinion. Think about it, discuss it. Don't necessarily get angry. Don't get furious. Talk about it. There is common ground there, believe it or not, although you may not find it.
Next question. Has COVID accelerated the death of print media? Well, I think in some respects, yes, it has. It depends which print media. I think it's certainly accelerated the death of local papers and local newspapers, which is very sad. I mean, that was obviously something that was already in a death spiral. There has been good evidence, though, of magazines seeing an increase in subscriptions. I know the Tablet has seen an increase in print subscriptions. The Spectator has seen an increase and have paid back the furlough money from the government. So I think it depends which part of the print media, but yes, certainly it's a massive challenge, and I think it is really sad, though, the demise of local papers, and I think this is something the church can respond to. And I mentioned the example of a church in Kent actually employing a journalist to go out and get stories. I mean, the local papers are really a part of communities. They bring communities together, and when they go under, it's really, really sad, and a part of the community goes as well. And I think it is something that the church can do something about, or should try and do something about.
Right. Has COVID accelerated the death of print media? Yes, is a short answer to that. Print media, certainly at a local level, is in a steady decline anyway. But of course, if companies go to the wall, there's fewer adverts to be had. There's less revenue from that point of view. Some magazines have strong subscription, and I've done very well. Private Eye is another one that's done particularly well out of the situation here. But yes, there's less money to go around, and sadly, local newspapers have suffered. Local radio, for other reasons, has also suffered in a similar period of time. And this is why I love this story about the church in Kent. There are so many local stories that aren't going to be represented now. And this is a great way forward. I'd like to see more of it. There are more community stories out there, and they need to be brought to the attention of mainstream, I hate that word, media. And I just think, as I say, I think there should be more of it. There's going to be more of a role for that, as communities are not going to feel that they've been represented.
Okay, another question's coming in about social media and fomenting conspiracy theories that are inimical, how long was that, right, to the faith. Now, yes, we do see examples of that. I mean, sadly, the conspiracy theories in some respects are being peddled from within the church. And in my book, I write a lot about Archbishop Vigano, who tried to basically bring down Pope Francis. He is now someone who is peddling a lot of conspiracy theories and tried to push a conspiracy theory about COVID-19 during the pandemic. Unfortunately, there are Catholic media platforms who will give Archbishop Vigano an uncritical platform and will unfortunately spread conspiracy ideas, or will not base their reporting in evidence. So I think it is important that the church is trying as much as it can to offer media or content that can be trusted.
One of the regular contributors to one of the programs I worked on was a scientist, and he once did a talk about the mathematics of a conspiracy theory, about how many people it would involve to do various things. I can rant about this for quite a long time, but I won't. But I would just like to say, in terms of conspiracy theories, it is far easier, it's far more logical that something went wrong because somebody screwed up in a faulty system. It doesn't take hundreds and thousands of people to be in on a secret. The chances are somebody just messed up, and we've all done that. For the most part, I would like to think there's nothing sinister involved. Of course, I may be naive in this, and there may be some response to that. But my first thought would always be, it's a screw up.
I also think sometimes you need a rapid response to these conspiracy theories. You don't need to respond to everything, but you need to have a plan, a strategy of how you're going to respond, because it's not good enough just to say, oh, well, that will go away and we can forget about it, because these things do sometimes take hold, and social media allows them to. So having a strategy of dealing with misinformation and rapid response is very important. A question about how might Catholic schools play a positive part in social media interactions. there's, as the questioner Anna Lee says, there's huge spheres of influence here. I mean, let's see if Catholic schools can take TikTok by storm. Who can be the first Catholic school to have 10,000 followers on TikTok? I think there's massive potential here, and not just on TikTok, but all medium. I think there are examples of schools, Catholic schools, who are using social media, but I think definitely engaging with it, but also I think encouraging pupils and forming pupils in how to be wise in their digital interactions, but also offering opportunities for what I would call digital ministry, because I think there could be opportunities for, say, young people leaving school to spend a year involved in digital ministry in some form for a parish, for a diocese, or for a community, a bit like the church that's employed a local journalist. There could be opportunities for, say, young people who want to get into media to have some experience of, say, promoting their parish across social media, and that could be an example of some work experience that could help them in a future career in the media. That's just one idea.
Again, I haven't really got anything to add to that, but I think the idea of schools getting involved in TikTok and promoting messages like that, I think it's a great idea. And again, responsible use of social media. These things are quite useful skills now. These children will be growing up to do jobs that don't even exist at the moment. So the idea of getting familiar with that kind of environment, I think, is a great thing. And if you can get a suitable message across with something that the children have made, get people involved, inspire them. I think it's a great idea. Follow it up.
There we go. Well, if there are no more questions, I'd like to thank everyone for taking part. Thank you, Rudy, and hand over to Simon.